All right, so get ready because today we're diving into a world where, thankfully, we never had to live a world where the Nazis actually won World War II. And to guide us through this, we're pulling some excerpts from this text titled, What If the Nazis Had Won the War.txt? And let me tell you, it's a pretty wild ride.
It really is. But exploring these alternate histories can be really valuable.
Yeah.
It gives us a much deeper appreciation for just how significant the Allied victory was and also how truly horrifying the consequences might have been.
Yeah, no kidding. So let's just jump right into it, okay?
Yeah.
The text lays out Hitler's big goal, his vision for this greater German Reich. And get this, it's supposed to stretch all the way to the Ural Mountains in Russia. We're talking like a land grab of epic proportions here.
Right. Absolutely massive.
So what was driving this insane ambition?
Well, at the core of it all was this concept of Lebensraum, which translates to living space, that
Yeah.
Hitler was absolutely convinced the German people needed to thrive. But, it wasn't just about grabbing land. It was really deeply intertwined with, the whole Nazi racial ideology, their belief that the so-called Aryan race was superior. And, the horrific plan to just eliminate or enslave anyone they considered, inferior.
Right. Yeah, and that's where that general plan Ost comes into play, right?
Yeah.
This plan was basically a blueprint for genocide and ethnic cleansing on a scale that's almost impossible to even grasp.
Exactly, yeah, that's exactly it. The goal was to wipe out like 85% of the populations of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and the Soviet Union west of the Ural. So
Mhm.
we're talking about potentially 110 million people murdered, another 15 million deported off to Siberia, and then the remaining 54 million. Well, they'd either be quote unquote Germanized into this, like slave labor force, or also deported.
God, those numbers are just staggering. It's hard to even wrap your head around the sheer scale of the horror that could have, actually happened. And then, of course, for the Jewish population under Nazi victory, the outcome would have been even more horrific, right?
Absolutely, yeah. By 1945 alone, the Nazis had already murdered over 80% of the Jewish population in countries like Poland, Greece, Lithuania, and Yugoslavia. So a Nazi victory.
Mhm.
The remaining 4 million European Jews would face the same fate.
So essentially, we're looking at a world where over 114 million people are systematically murdered just for who they are. It's a stark reminder of just how much was at stake in World War II and the truly profound consequences of the Allied victory. But of course, the Nazis didn't get to achieve this horrific vision of theirs. They were defeated, and the world was spared from this absolute nightmare scenario.
Right.
So to understand like how that defeat actually happened, we need to take a look at some of the factors that ultimately led to Germany's downfall.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so the text mentions a few key weaknesses right off the bat. First, Germany's war economy, especially in those early years, just wasn't quite up to snuff. They weren't prepared for a conflict of this scale. And then, their decision to fight a war on two fronts, that proved to be incredibly costly. Battling both the Western Allies and the Soviet Union at the same time, I mean, it stretched their resources way too thin, and that ultimately led to their defeat.
Yeah, fighting on two fronts is, well, it's rarely a good idea. It just splits your forces and creates so many logistical nightmares.
Yeah, no kidding. And then there's that disastrous invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. I mean, granted, they made some really fast initial gains, but ultimately that vast geography of the Soviet Union, their much larger population, and their abundant oil reserves proved to be insurmountable obstacles.
Yeah, and they made some critical tactical errors too. They weren't prepared at all for the harsh Russian winters. Their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and they just completely failed to exploit the resentment that existed against Soviet rule in some of those occupied territories, like with the Ukrainians.
It's like they really underestimated the challenges they were going to face in these. But then there's the big one, right? Hitler's declaration of war on the United States.
Oh yeah, that was, I mean, you could argue that was Hitler's most fatal blunder, because it brought the full industrial and military might of the U.S. into the war against Germany, and that just drastically shifted the balance of power in favor of the Allies.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine what he was thinking, taking on the U.S. with their massive economy, huge population, and being self-sufficient in oil. I mean, it seems like an act of pure madness.
Yeah, it was a strategic miscalculation, like of epic proportions. A war he could never win. And when you look at the economic disparities between Germany and its rivals, it becomes even more clear.
Yeah, the text really highlights that gap. Germany's GDP wasn't that far behind the Soviet Union's, but both the British Empire and the US, their economies were more than twice Germany's size.
Right, and it wasn't just about, raw numbers. The Allied powers also had um, significantly larger populations and access to vast resources, including oil, which was, like, essential for fueling their war machines. But Germany, they're heavily reliant on imports and constantly facing shortages. So even with some, tactical adjustments, a Nazi victory in the East, highly unlikely.
So, given all of that, could the Nazis have actually won the war? Despite these, like, glaring weaknesses. I mean, the text mentions that this idea has been explored a lot in media, like, you've got Amazon's series, The Man in the High Castle. But just how realistic is that scenario?
It's a question that's fascinated historians and storytellers for like decades. And while a complete Nazi victory seems, highly improbable, there are a few what if scenarios worth exploring. Like, for example, what if Germany had actually won the Battle of Britain? Ah, yes, the Battle of Britain, a major turning point in the war for sure. For those who might not be familiar with it, could you quickly explain the significance?
Sure, yeah. The Battle of Britain was this massive air campaign that the German Luftwaffe waged against the British Royal Air Force back in 1940. The goal was to gain air superiority over Britain, which would then, pave the way for a potential invasion. Now, the RAF, even though they were outnumbered, they fought back hard and ultimately repelled the German attack. This failure to defeat Britain was a major setback for Hitler's plans.
So, if the Germans had won the Battle of Britain, they could have potentially launched a successful invasion
Yeah.
or maybe even forced Britain into some kind of negotiated peace, which would have been huge, taking a major player out of the war and freeing up all those resources for the Eastern Front.
Exactly, yeah. But even then, the challenges of actually conquering the Soviet Union, those would have remained, immense. And of course, there's still the U.S. to contend with. Defeating the U.S. with their colossal economy and vast population and their self-sufficiency in oil, that would have been virtually impossible for Germany to pull off.
Especially without developing atomic weapons first.
Precisely. And let's not forget, a Nazi victory, it doesn't mean, a peaceful world. It just means a different kind of conflict, a different set of challenges.
You're talking about that Cold War scenario we touched on earlier.
Exactly, yeah. Imagine a world where the Iron Curtain doesn't fall across Europe,
Hmm.
but across the English Channel. A world where it's Nazi Germany, not the Soviet Union, that becomes the global rival to the United States.
Wow, that's a pretty chilling thought. A whole different kind of Cold War with completely different alliances and conflicts and consequences.
It's a fascinating and unsettling what if to think about. And in our next part, we'll actually explore some of the potential ramifications of this alternate Cold War. Like the potential flashpoints, the forms of resistance that might emerge, that sort of thing.
Welcome back. So last time we left off with this image of a world where the Nazis actually won World War II against all odds. We were just starting to explore this hypothetical Cold War scenario with a Nazi-controlled Europe facing off against the United States. And it's a chilling thought, but I'm curious what some of the hot spots would be in this alternate world.
Well, think about the flashpoints of the Cold War, the one we know.
Hmm.
Berlin, Korea, Vietnam, those were all proxy battlegrounds where the ideologies and ambitions of the U.S. and the Soviet Union clashed. Now imagine that same dynamic, but with Nazi Germany as that opposing superpower. The entire geopolitical landscape would be completely different.
Yeah, totally. So where might those proxy wars erupt in this Nazi-dominated world? Any guesses based on what the text suggests?
Well, the text actually points to one particularly interesting possibility, Iceland. Now, you might be thinking, Iceland? Seriously?
Yeah, I mean Iceland.
But bear with me.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Why Iceland? It seems like a pretty unlikely battleground.
Geographically, Iceland would have been incredibly valuable in a Cold War with Nazi Germany because it's strategically located right there in the North Atlantic, putting it within striking distance of both North America and Europe. And remember, this is a world where nuclear weapons actually exist.
Oh wow, okay, I see where you're going with this. So Iceland becomes like the Cuba of this alternate Cold War, a potential like trigger point for a nuclear showdown.
Exactly, yeah. For the Nazis, controlling Iceland would be like holding a gun to the head of North America. They could deploy intermediate range missiles there, capable of hitting major cities in the U.S. and Canada. But on the flip side, for the U.S., controlling Iceland would be like crucial for denying the Nazis that strategic advantage, and of course protecting those vital shipping lanes in the North Atlantic.
Okay, yeah, that's wild.
Yeah.
So instead of worrying about Soviet missiles in Cuba, we'd be sweating over Nazi nukes in Iceland. The whole Cold War chessboard would be like completely rearranged.
Absolutely, yeah. Alliances, rivalries, spheres of influence, everything would be different. Imagine a world where the U.S. is pouring resources into defending Greenland, forging alliances with Scandinavian countries, and maybe even maybe even trying to peel off disgruntled factions within the Nazi Empire.
It's like a whole new game of Risk, but with totally different players and objectives. But what about the people living under Nazi rule in this scenario? Would they just passively accept this new world order? I mean, we've seen throughout history that people uh, always find ways to resist oppression.
Yeah, you're right. Resistance is it's a constant throughout history, and in this alternate timeline, we might actually see the U.S. playing a role similar to what they did during our Cold War, supporting underground resistance movements within the Nazi sphere of influence.
So picture this CIA operative sneaking into occupied France or Poland, arming and training rebel groups, plotting sabotage missions. It'd be like a real life spy thriller.
Exactly, yeah. And those resistance movements would be incredibly brave, facing a regime known for its brutality and vast surveillance network.
Right. But remember, the Nazis weren't like universally loved, even in Germany. I mean, during the war, you had groups like the White Rose, individuals like Claus von Stauffenberg. They actively tried to overthrow Hitler from within. So it's not hard to imagine that kind of resistance continuing in a post-war Nazi state.
Absolutely. And as time went on, that resistance could find new forms of expression, especially as cultural trends shifted. The text notes how movements like the hippie counterculture and the rise of rock and roll, those would have likely been suppressed in a Nazi-controlled Europe.
Oh man, can you imagine a world where the Beatles are considered like dangerous subversives, their music ban? It'll be like living in a cultural wasteland.
Exactly, yeah. But music, art, ideas, they have a way of defying boundaries.
Yeah.
Even if driven underground, those cultural forces would become these powerful symbols of rebellion.
Right. It's like that old saying, you can imprison a man, but you can't imprison an idea. So you'd have like secret rock concerts and hidden basements, forbidden books being passed, hand to hand,
Yeah.
and maybe even a samizdat style underground press churning out anti-Nazi literature.
Precisely. And as technology evolved, those forms of resistance could become even more sophisticated.
Yeah.
Imagine dissident groups using the internet to communicate, share information, and mobilize support, even across borders.
Man, that's mind-blowing. The Nazis were all about controlling information, but could they have actually contained the internet, this vast network of ideas and dissent? I doubt it.
It's a fascinating question. The Nazis were technologically advanced in many ways, but they might have found themselves playing catch up in the digital age.
Right. It's like this paradox, right?
Yeah.
The Nazis might have won the war, but in the long run, could they really win over the hearts and minds of the people? Could they actually suppress that fundamental human desire for freedom and self-expression?
That's the million-dollar question. Historically speaking, even the most seemingly invincible empires, they eventually crumble,
Yeah.
From within. Would the Nazi regime be any different?
I mean, their entire ideology was based on hatred, exclusion, and the suppression of individual liberties. It's hard to imagine a society built on those foundations lasting very long.
Exactly. Their emphasis on racial purity, their glorification of violence, their rejection of Enlightenment values, all of those inherent contradictions would likely lead to internal tensions and eventually perhaps even to the regime's downfall.
It's like a house built on sand.
Yeah.
It might look impressive for a while, but sooner or later the tide comes in and the whole thing collapses.
That's a great analogy. And as as new generations arose, those who didn't actually experience the war firsthand, well, they might start questioning the whole Nazi system. They might look to the West, see the freedom and prosperity there, and start yearning for something different.
Plus, even in this Cold War scenario, you'd still have the U.S. and its allies constantly, applying pressure, diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, maybe even covert operations to try to destabilize the regime.
Absolutely. And all of those factors, internal dissent external pressure, the inherent contradictions of their ideology, all of that could eventually lead to the collapse of the Nazi Empire, just like we saw with the Soviet Union.
It's like a historical pressure cooker. Eventually, something has to give.
Exactly. Of course, predicting the future is impossible, even in an alternate timeline. But exploring these possibilities really helps us understand the complexities of history and the forces that shape our world.
Yeah, it reminds us that freedom is something you have to constantly fight for to protect. It's not a given, and it makes you wonder in this world where the Nazis won, how would culture have survived? How would art and science have adapted? That's a whole other rabbit hole to explore.
Indeed, it is. And in our final part, we'll dive into that very question: the cultural and social landscape of a world reshaped by a Nazi victory. What forms of art and science might have emerged? How would people have navigated, everyday life under such a regime?
Welcome back to the final part of this deep dive into this alternate timeline where the Nazis won World War II. We've talked about the global implications, a potential Cold War with Germany at the top, and even a nuclear standoff over Iceland. But now let's try and imagine what everyday life might have been like in this world, especially for artists and scientists living under Nazi rule.
It's a really interesting question. We know the Nazis had a very specific and rigid view of what they considered acceptable art and culture. Anything that didn't fit their narrow ideology, modern art, jazz music, literature that explored individualism, all of that would have been ruthlessly suppressed.
So no Picasso, no Miles Davis, no James Joyce. I mean, it's hard to even fathom a world without those giants of 20th century culture. But what would happen to the artists themselves? Would they have been forced to just become like mouthpieces for the regime, churning out Nazi propaganda?
Some might have, yeah, out of
Yeah.
fear or opportunism. Imagine a world where Salvador Dali is painting portraits of Hitler, or where George Gershwin is composing these triumphant marches for Nazi rallies. It's a pretty chilling thought.
It's like this twisted parallel universe where artistic genius is like warped and contorted to serve a totalitarian regime. But I refuse to believe that that every artist would just roll over and conform. Wouldn't there be those who resisted, who found ways to create art that challenged the Nazi worldview?
Of course, yeah. Throughout history, even under the most oppressive regimes, art has always found a way to resist, to subvert, to express dissent. Think about the music and poetry created in the concentration camps, or the clandestine exhibitions held in defiance of Nazi censorship. That spirit of defiance would have surely continued in a post-war Nazi state.
So you're talking about like an underground art scene, like a hidden world of creativity where artists are using coded messages, symbolism, double meanings to express their opposition to the regime.
Exactly. Yeah. Imagine like secret gatherings in darkened basements where people are sharing banned books and listening to forbidden music. Imagine artists using abstract art to convey messages that would be way too dangerous to express openly.
Wow, it'd be like a cultural speakeasy, a hidden world of artistic rebellion. And as technology advanced, those underground movements could find new ways to connect and spread their message, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Think about the potential impact of things like cassette tapes and underground radio stations. Those technologies could be used to disseminate forbidden music, literature, and even political ideas, completely bypassing the Nazi censors. And as we move into the digital age, the possibilities for resistance become even more intriguing.
The internet. Now that would be a game changer. Imagine dissident groups using online platforms to organize, share information, and connect with supporters around the world. It would be like a digital samizdat, a virtual network of resistance.
Right. The Nazis, despite their technological advancements in other areas, they might have found themselves really struggling to control the flow of information in the internet age. They might have won the war on the battlefields, but could they win the war of ideas in the digital realm?
Yeah, I doubt it. You can't build firewalls around people's minds, but but let's not forget about science. We know the Nazis were obsessed with scientific progress, but their ideology also led them down some very dark paths, especially in fields like genetics and medicine.
Absolutely. Their twisted beliefs about racial purity and eugenics, it led to horrific experiments and the perversion of science for truly inhumane ends.
Yeah.
It's chilling to think what kind of, quote unquote scientific breakthroughs might have been made in a world where ethical boundaries are just blurred, and research is driven by this desire to create a master race.
It's a frightening thought and a stark reminder of the dangers of allowing ideology to distort scientific inquiry. But wouldn't there be scientists who resisted this Nazi perversion of science? Scientists who held on to their principles and refused to compromise their ethics?
Of course, even within Nazi Germany, there were scientists who opposed the regime's ideology and worked to protect their colleagues and patients from the worst excesses of Nazi science. In this alternate timeline, we might see like a parallel scientific community operating in the shadows, maybe even collaborating secretly with scientists in the free world, to uphold the true spirit of scientific inquiry and resist the Nazis' attempts to twist science for their own dark purposes.
That's a glimmer of hope in this otherwise pretty bleak scenario. But zooming out a bit, how would everyday life have been different in a Nazi-controlled world? Would people have just accepted this new reality, or would there be this constant undercurrent of resistance and rebellion?
It's a question that historians and writers have debated for decades. Some envision a world of grim conformity where fear and surveillance are just pervasive, and any deviation from Nazi norms is ruthlessly punished. Others believe that human nature is more complex than that, and that people would find ways to resist, to carve out spaces of freedom and individuality, even in the most oppressive environments.
So it's not just about grand acts of rebellion or underground movements. It's also about the small acts of defiance, the whispers of dissent, the ways in which people hold on to their humanity and refuse to let their spirits be crushed.
Exactly. Yeah. Imagine families secretly celebrating banned holidays, parents passing down forbidden stories to their children, neighbors sharing smuggled books and music under the cover of darkness. These small acts of resistance, they might seem, insignificant on their own, but collectively they would represent a powerful force, a testament to the enduring human spirit.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope endures. And I think that's a fitting note to end our exploration of this alternate timeline on.
I agree. We've journeyed into a world where the Nazis won, a world reshaped by their ideology and ambitions. It's been a chilling and thought-provoking experience exploring the potential ramifications for politics, culture, science, and everyday life.
But while this alternate history is thankfully just a hypothetical scenario, it serves as a potent reminder of the fragility of freedom, the dangers of unchecked power, and the importance of vigilance in safeguarding the values we hold dear.
It also underscores the enduring power of the human spirit to resist oppression, to find hope in the darkest of times, and to strive for a better world.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into an alternate history. We hope it's left you with much to ponder about the forces that shape our world and the choices we face as individuals and as a society. This is the deep dive signing off.